My name is Dr. Michael Brown, and this is 3 Words, a bite-sized podcast about the small and yet very significant choices that all of us can make in order to feel fully alive. Today, I have in the studio with me Barb Roose, who reminds me and will remind you that some days you wake up, you're not feeling fully alive. In fact, you're feeling sad and hurt and frustrated, maybe even angry. What do you say to yourself in the mirror on those days? We'll talk about that in this episode. Listen in. Barb, it is fantastic to have you back here in the 3 Words podcast studio. I feel like you were just here. In fact, you were for our last season. We had an incredible conversation about just for today, those 3 words. And I'm looking forward to our conversation that we're going to have in just a few moments. But first, some of our viewers and listeners, they may not know who Barb Roose is. Share a little bit about yourself.
Well, I have been living in your guest bathroom since the last episode because it was really not that long ago, and I just thought this feels like a nice place. So when I am not hiding out in your guest bathroom, I'm a speaker and author. I live in the Northwest Ohio area, proud mom of 3 kids who no longer live in my house. I also have 2 bonus in-law kids, and my passion is teaching mostly women, but I love helping people live strong and courageous, helping them overcome fear, because I believe that God has a great adventure of faith and purpose for every single one of our lives.
And I'm imagining that not only are you wanting individuals to be fully alive and strong and courageous and confident and so forth, but I'm guessing the 3 words you chose for today are also something you probably talk about with people on a regular basis.
And it's something that I really hold as a value for myself on a regular basis. This one's personal for me.
Well, let's share our 3 words then.
Those 3 words are give yourself grace.
I feel like I want to take a big, deep breath as you say that, because obviously I need grace. You need grace. And it feels, even as you say that, it brings this sense of freedom to me. But let's have you kick it off the conversation. Why are these 3 words so important to you, Barb?
I have a quick random story. When my oldest was in high school, my oldest played basketball. And I remember it was a varsity basketball game. It was a team from out of town, and they were a top-ranked team in the state of Ohio. It was girls basketball. And I remember being in the small gym at my kid's school, and the coach of that other team screamed at his girls from the start of the game, all 4 quarters of the game. He never stopped yelling at them, criticizing them. He never stopped picking at them. And the whole game, those girls were trying to concentrate and they were trying to win. And there was this constant screaming voice at them that they were no good. And why did you make that mistake? And I believe that for most of us today, that voice is coming from the inside, that we are often constantly criticizing ourselves, yelling at ourselves, condemning ourselves. And I think we need to shift that because it's not serving what that life that we want of peace and hope and purpose. We have to undo that negative self-talk.
When I'm imagining even the team that you described was not performing at their highest level because they were functioning in fear. They were playing out of, terror. Yeah. Don't do something wrong or you're going to get yelled at. I don't think we as human beings thrive in a environment of angry criticism.
You know, it was interesting though, that you could tell they were used to it. It didn't faze them. For us as the away team, we were horrified. And I remember wanting to get off of the bench and walk over and punch that guy's lights out. But again, if we think about just how far too many of us today, we have normalized negative self-talk. We have normalized it. We don't think anything of calling ourselves stupid, idiot, dummy. And so give yourself grace pushes back against that negativity that we've normalized inside of ourselves.
Well, isn't it true too, Barb, that there are probably things that we're saying to ourselves on a regular basis that we would never share with our best friend? We would never say those kinds of things to the people we love the most. And yet we, like you said, have been conditioned or have learned to just become accustomed to this self-talk within our heads. Maybe it's because it's not audible. And so we don't even realize it's happening. It's just rolling around in our head. An unwanted guest, if they showed up at our house, for instance, and they sat down on our couch, we'd eventually say, it's time for you to go home.
Very much so.
Because there they are visibly. But sometimes those thoughts and that negativity, as you just described, it just gets stuck there and unquestioned, unchallenged, uncensored, and just let the imposter of negativity just run rampant through the apartment or the house of our mind.
Very, very much so. And it starts for many of us first thing in the morning. We get out of the bed, and one of the very first things that we do is we look in the bathroom mirror. And based on all of the statistics that are out there, women more so than men, but definitely for men as well. My very first book's called Enough Already, Winning Your Ugly Struggle with Beauty. And the premise of the book is, if you give a woman 30 seconds in a mirror, she'll tell you everything that's wrong with her. And the men will do the same thing. When you get up in the morning and you go in the bathroom, the thing that we do is we survey what has changed. We're not looking for what's gone right. We're looking for what's gone wrong. And so that's where our day starts. And then as we're just going, before we ever get out the door to start our day, we have found reasons why we're falling short, why we're not enough, why we need to do more, do better. And all of that accumulates as this toxicity in our lives.
If I may, I'm going to pause right now in the middle of my conversation with Barb to simply invite you to share this particular episode with a friend who you're thinking to yourself, they could use a little grace. Now back to our conversation. Well, and it's not like you're saying we shouldn't study our mistakes, which is a podcast episode that we gave, or to learn from the challenges that we faced, or to even deal with regret. But what you're suggesting is that the primary, that the most and the flavor of most of our self-talk should be positive, the things that are actually going well and who we're becoming, not just how we're performing.
That's what it should be. That's what it should be. But here, let's be honest about though. As humans, we're not helping each other out. I was on social media yesterday, and I spend a lot of my life on social media, and there was someone who was doing a commentary about how nothing gets popularized on social media unless it's negative. So as a culture, as regular people in the discourse of our lives, we have signal boosted negativity. We have made it the currency that's desirable. When something is negative, we pay attention to it. So is it that you and I, when we engage in negative self-talk, we somehow in a twisted sort of way, that becomes self-motivation. Because if we're beating ourselves up, if we're speaking negative, like that's what we think is going to get us to change.
Well, and I would say it's short term, because there is something, if you use the illustration of the basketball team, if I have a coach who's yelling at me at the top of their lungs, I might perform at a high level, maybe for a wrong motivation, but at a high level for a very short period of time, but that's not sustainable.
And why is it not sustainable?
Because it's not who we were created to be, in the sense that our identity is made in the image of God. Yeah. And so we are, though we are fallen and though we struggle, we have so many beautiful qualities about us that resemble the Creator. Yes. And so I think in many ways too, what's motivating for us is affirmation. And again, I know some people say, well, they don't need any more grace. You know what they need? Truth. And I would say Jesus, and you and I both are big fans of that guy, he came with grace and truth, and it was side by side. So grace, as you're describing it, as we can speak grace to ourselves and give ourselves grace, it's not in opposition to truth. We need to be honest. Reality is our friend. Yes. But what is kind of that overarching thrust and theme of that conversation we're having with ourselves?
And grace in and of itself, grace is it's favor. Grace built in within the definition is there has to be imperfection and falling short. And so when we give ourselves grace, that comes with the understanding that it's a gift we're giving to ourselves because we are imperfect. Grace is actually what makes truth possible. Because when I make a mistake and when you make a mistake and we give ourselves grace, that means that we're acknowledging that we messed up. But accountability is much more apt to follow grace in the absence of accountability, that's where we find people struggling. When people are in recovery programs, when they've got to admit fault, they're going to be much more likely to be fully and completely honest when someone looks them in the eyes and says, I know you messed up. And I love you and I care about you and you are worthy just as you were before, even though this is wrong. That's what's going to make it possible for someone to get on the road again to becoming their best selves.
I was waiting for you to somehow connect what are next steps and how grace can have a dark side. But the fact that you've connected grace to accountability and the fact that grace not only presumes accountability, but it actually invites accountability. Yes. That is where I feel like our listeners will be like, okay, that makes sense. Because there's some people who are going to be listening or viewing this episode saying, well, when I give grace to people, they just go wild and they do their thing. And they're like, they don't have to take responsibility for the choices they made. You're not diminishing the responsibility for our choices. We're simply saying the choices aren't going to be perfect. And we get to be fully human and we get to be imperfect, which is what fully human means.
And I want folks to kind of absorb that, to be fully human. Also there's a little distinction I want to build in. Today we're talking about giving yourself grace. There's a different layer when we're giving others grace. We can give others grace, but we also have got to have some boundaries there. When we're giving ourselves grace, we want to also build within it the responsibility of self-accountability. Mm-hmm. If I'm going to give myself grace, for last week, I forgot to pay my life insurance and I got a little note that something had happened and something didn't get debited. And there was a note Saturday that it got terminated. And I'm like, oh my gosh, I can't die before I get it back or whatever. And so I just felt dumb because it was something I didn't take care of. Well, the thing that I said to myself was, Barb, you should have taken care of that. Shoot, that's a bummer, Barb. But you know what? You're going to fix that. And do not spend any time beating yourself up for that. It happened. That's it. So I gave myself grace. I had to give myself responsibility. I made a commitment to how I was going to be actionable. When it comes to giving others grace, we can give others grace, but then there are some other things that we also have to keep in mind as far as boundaries. Giving someone grace does not mean that allows people to run right over you. Giving others grace does not mean that you have to let down the walls of safety. But when you give yourself grace, that you have agency. You're in control of accountability, responsibility, and compassion towards yourself.
And you have said this on so many occasions. In our last episode, just for today, you use that word compassion.
Yes.
To say this is a compassionate response to not needing to be perfect today and to be in process today and not to do everything today. So it's interesting how all of the different episodes that we've had and the conversations that we've engaged in together all tend to come back to this idea, if I may thematize it, that we're not perfect, that we're all in process, that our failures are not fatal, that we can choose our way into change.
Yes, we love that.
I mean, there's so many powerful ideas, all of which are encouraging our viewers and listeners, and even as we look in the mirror, ourselves, Barb, to continue to be committed to evolving, growing, maturing, and becoming better, all with a very kind, compassionate, and open-handed perspective.
If I can kind of help as we're kind of coming in for a landing, years ago, I went through a long season of separation and divorce, and it wasn't my choice. It wasn't something that I had the situation created, but there was a lot of shame involved in the failure of a 25-year marriage. There was a lot of shame of, am I worthy, and all these things. And I made a decision all those years ago, and this would be, I hope, a practical application for a listener. Every morning when I got up and I walked into the bathroom and the weight of so many things was on my shoulders, I simply said this to myself in the mirror: if today, on my worst days, I will treat myself the best. And I would say that to myself in the mirror each day as a decision to give myself grace, because I knew in advance I would struggle throughout the day. But I was going to make the choice to treat myself the best, that I was going to be kind in the choices that I made about how I was going to behave toward myself. And I wasn't going to treat myself like trash because I felt like trash, but I was going to treat myself the best even though my circumstances weren't the best. And so I want to just share that as maybe a practical step that someone could take when they look at the mirror first thing in the morning.
Thanks for not only challenging our perspective, thanks for being vulnerable and real, and then giving us a very practical way to begin to put into practice this idea of giving ourselves grace. Barb, always a pleasure.
Thank you. I'm honored.
I want to thank you for joining my conversation with Barb Roose today and for being on this journey with 3 Words Podcast. We value our friendship with you, our partnership with you. We want to continue to increase our connection to you. And one way to do that is to simply go to dmbcoaching.com/subscribe and subscribe to our monthly newsletter. There's a lot of great content, great conversations that we're having digitally with our friends and our partners of 3 Words, and we hope that you'll be inspired and encouraged even beyond the conversations we have here every other Monday morning. So until I see you again, until you listen in again, make it a great, great couple of weeks.